Galston parish runs along the River Irvine, which forms its northern boundary for about 10 miles from its source at Loudon Hill, until it meets its tributary the Cessnock, which forms the western boundary. To the south, the boundary is the watershed on the Galston Moor, and to the east the River Avon. The land is generously watered by the Irvine and its feeder burns, and varies in height from 150 feet at the river bank to over 1,200 feet at Distinct Horn on its eastern boundary. Much of the land is boulder clay, but has been drained so that around 60% of the area is under tillage or grass. Curiously, Galston is more fertile than Loudon, although it has a more northern exposure. There are considerable areas of woodland, particularly in Linfeen. These are principally hardwood or mixed with conifers on the poorer ground. The trees were first planted in the second half of the 18th century to provide cover for hunts and shoots and to give shelter to stock. At the same time, permanent hedges were planted. Farming is mostly cattle, with sheep in the moorland areas. Oats, turnips and potatoes were formerly widely grown by rotation, but farmers are now reluctant to plough down good grass. Pigs used to be kept in fairly large numbers to consume the whey pie products of cheese making, but most milk now goes straight to the creameries. Limestone and ironstone have been worked on the banks of the Burnon, and large quantities of sandstone have been raised at Nowhead and particularly Gauchland. Agate has been found at Molmont Hill, but not of gemstone quality, and the Burnon is famous for its beautiful jasper, known as Burnon pebbles. The town of Galston is the oldest surviving settlement in the upper Irvine Valley, and its name appears to mean the place of the strangers, from the Gaelic Gaul, meaning stranger, and the Anglian Tun, a hamlet. The name probably dates to the time when the water of Cessnock, or the water of the Sassenachs, formed the eastern boundary of the Anglo-Norman influence. Evidence of the existence of a township in Galston since ancient times is the fact that a parish church, possibly on the site of the present one, was under the control of the Trinitarian order of friars in the 13th century, and it is believed that they actually took over an existing church which would have operated according to the old Celtic form of Christianity. Around the same time, the great Marshal of Scotland was Sir John Keith, whose home was at Galston Tower, now known as Cessnock Castle. His grandson, Sir William Keith, gained fame at the Battle of Berwick in 1318, when he prevented the reoccupation of the town by the English. Later he brought the heart of King Robert the Bruce back to Scotland, when it had been taken on a crusade against the Moors in Spain. This was commemorated by the inclusion in the coat of arms of the old borough of Galston of a heart held in a mailed fist. William Wallace in 1296 defeated an English convoy near the Wynne-Wisson, and Robert the Bruce in 1307 routed an English army also in the vicinity of Loudon Hill. Both armies had assembled at Galston prior to travelling up the valley to meet the enemy. At that time, the route of the present main road through the valley consisted of marshes and bogs. Then the path from Galston to Loudon Hill would have been roughly where the minor road runs via Gallow Hill and Auchenbart. In 1494, the name Campbell of Cessnock is listed as one of the Lollards of Kyle, accused of heresy by the Archbishop of Glasgow. One charge against him was of listening to the scriptures being read in the vernacular by Murdoch Nisbet of Newmilns, the Bible translator who was connected to the Nisbets of Greenholme, who had owned land there since the introduction of feudalism. Although Galston continued as a settled township, there was no single large landowner, and this prevented the development of a borough. Several prominent families existed, including the Lockharts of Barr, who owned property in the parish since the 14th century. The family built the Barr Castle in the 15th century, and the best-known member was John Lockhart, who invited the reforming martyr George Wishart to preach at the castle in 1545, and later in 1556 John Knox also preached there when he was barred from the parish church. Lockhart was a fanatical reformer who was tried in 1550 for theft with violence and spoliation of churches, chapels and other religious houses. Barr Castle was originally surmounted by battlements, but these were replaced by a pavilion roof for safety reasons and other improvements made around 1800. It was used at that time as a grain store and a prison. It has had many owners over the centuries and was in poor condition when it passed from the Duke of Portland to the Freemasons, who have been responsible for its preservation. Without the masons, it is doubtful if the castle would still be intact today. Certainly it would not be in such a good condition. Quite recently, they have established a museum on the top floor. By the middle of the 17th century, the Kirktown had a population of around 250, all living on the higher ground near the church, although most people then lived and worked in the countryside, taking the total in the parish to over 1,000. The influence of the church was all important in the parish, and its records give an impression of the activities in the town. With no borough council, the Kirk session was the dominant force and took the lead in providing social services as well as maintaining order, although from 1694 or earlier, a Baron Bailey was appointed with authority to hold courts. The 18th century saw the town expand to 455 in 1777 and to 573 in 1791. By this time, the majority of the populace were engaged in textile manufacture, and this would continue into the 19th century, but coal mining would become increasingly important. Although Galston appears to have been built up around a very early church, there is little knowledge of its early days. The connection with the monks of Fale is known from the 13th century. The road from Galston to Fale still follows the original track, with the church orchards, including the top of the present Orchard Street and the manse grounds at what is still locally called the Manse Brae. The church was dedicated to St. Peter, and an annual fair was held at Galston on St. Peter's Day, the 29th of June. Up until the end of the 19th century, bonfires were being lit on St. Peter's Eve on hills such as Molmont, where a Caledonian stone circle of about 60 feet in diameter once stood on the summit, hinting at an earlier religion. We know that there was a vicar of Galston in 1444, by which time a cross stood in what is now called Cross Street, which was formerly known as the Lake Kirkyard, and where the fairs were held. The cross was removed in the 19th century. The early church reformers were active in Galston and its surroundings, with both Wishart and Knox active in the area from the 1540s. After the Reformation, the monastery at Fale was destroyed, and Galston lost its vicar. Also lost for a time was the influence of the church in social matters such as care for the poor and sick. There was a shortage of trained ministers, and Galston shared with Loudon Parish an exhorter or assistant minister. For 9 years from 1567, Rankin Davidson carried out the work of preaching, baptising and giving religious instruction, as well as maintaining the records of the two parishes, while one minister, Peter Primrose, had Mauchline as well as the other two parishes in his charge. In 1569, it is believed that a new church was erected. This building was a plain oblong structure running east-west on the site of the present church, and would have no ceiling, but only open rafters. By around 1630, we know that the roof was slated, a gallery had been built, and seating was being provided. Soon the building was extended by the erection of aisles on the north and south to form the shape of a cross. Over the years, the gloom was relieved by the provision of windows and skylights to augment the original two small windows. At the east end was a tower which housed the bell and a clock. Church records suggest that it was not until 1638 that the session was able to purchase a Kirk Bible at a cost of £13, 6 shillings and 8 pence. The 17th century saw troubled times in the church when Charles I tried to impose an episcopal system. Galston was not immune from these troubles, and in 1638 no fewer than 328 men from Galston parish subscribed to the National Covenant, led by the minister Alexander Wallace, and including all the leading families. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660 gave no respite to the people of Galston. Soldiers were quartered on townspeople without payment, and the folks in Galston were continually persecuted. James Smith of East Threepwood was killed by soldiers near the farm on the banks of the Burnon. During the general strike in 1926, a team of unemployed workers, mainly miners, built a cairn and viewpoint at Gallow Hill in his memory. It was quite a popular picnic spot for many years, but is now hardly visited. Sir Hugh Campbell of Cessnock was fined a total of £2,300, then he was imprisoned and his lands confiscated. The Galston minister Alexander Blair, who earlier had travelled with the Covenanters as a military chaplain, was imprisoned in 1673, but later released. He died the following year. In 1679, James Young and George Campbell were banished to the American plantations, but died in a shipwreck before they had left Scottish waters. The last muster of the Covenanters ended at Killiecrankie in 1689. Over 200 men of Galston took part, and 25 died in the campaign. The present church was built in 1809 during the ministry of George Smith, the great-grandfather of Robert Louis Stevenson. The sale of materials from the old church raised £150, and the total cost of building the new one came to £3,200. The church was built to accommodate 1,020 people, and the spire rises to 120 feet. The minister from 1824 to 1878 was Robert Stirling, who was responsible for the Stirling heat engine, in which the working fluid at that time, air, was heated by an external source. It suffered at the time because of the lack of suitable materials of construction, and was eclipsed by the invention of the internal combustion engine. At present, however, interest has been revived due to its ability to utilise a wide variety of fuels. This engine was made by Stuart Mills and is heated by solar energy concentrated by the parabolic mirror. The mission hall was used by the parish church as a sort of outreach into the community, as was another at the Galston. As well as services, dances and other functions were held here. During the last war it was the cookhouse for the large numbers of soldiers billeted around the town. It is still used by the Life Boys and the Boys Brigade. Other churches in the town included the United Presbyterians, who left the parish church in 1737. They moved to a meeting house in Wallace Street in 1800 and built a church, later called the Erskine Church, on the site in 1859. The Old Free Church was built at the Kilnow following the disruption of 1843. The manse still stands in Maxwood Road. It was replaced in 1887 by the Trinity Church, which stood in Glebe Knowes behind the Burnside School. It formed the new parish church with the Erskine in 1949, and the building was initially used by the joint membership, but dry rot forced its closure. It was demolished in 1963 and the Erskine Church building used for worship. They combined with the parish church in 1980. A breakaway from the Erskine Church led to the small congregational church which survived in Chapel Lane as part of the Evangelical Union until 1962, when the church was soon demolished to make way for housing. In the 1860s, a group of Cornish tin miners arrived in the valley as strike breakers. They soon became part of the community, but were Methodists and did not fit naturally into the local churches. By 1871, they had joined with like-minded natives, and the first Brethren meetings were held in Galston. Early meetings were held in people's houses and then in various halls, the first being in Old Man's Close, and their numbers quickly rose to around 150. For a time, meetings were held in the Cooperative Hall in Titchfield Street, but this was not always available, and a move was made to a hall in Henrietta Street in 1879. A growth in numbers, including a movement from the Ebenezer Hall in Orchard Street, enabled them to assist in the establishment of assemblies in Newmilns and Hurlford. A bigger and better hall was desired, and land was purchased from the Church of Scotland at Glebe Dykes. The present building was erected, and the opening was in November 1898. Numbers have risen and fallen over the years, but they are still going strong after more than 100 years. The expansion of the town in the 19th century saw the arrival of an increasing number of Roman Catholics to the district. Around 1800, a refugee French priest who taught mathematics in Ayr visited his flock in the valley as and when he could, and he was followed by other priests based in Ayr. Responsibility for our area passed to the new district of Kilmarnock in 1847. Initially, Catholics travelled to Kilmarnock to worship, but the priest was soon meeting with his people in the Black Bull in Bridge Street. By 1876, a weaver's cottage in Old Man's Close had been converted into a place of worship, and this was used until the erection of the imposing structure in Bentinck Street, which was opened in 1886 with the celebration of Mass at midnight on Christmas Eve. The construction of the church was financed by the Marquis of Bute and modelled on the Basilica of St. Sophia in Istanbul, in honour of his mother Sophia Hastings. The building is mainly of brick with external layers of white stone, and there is a massive grandeur about the building which is certainly unique in the west of Scotland. For many centuries, Galston as a kirk town consisted mainly of dwellings close to the church, and was confined to an area to the east of the Burnawn and north of the Irvine, comprising Old Man's Close, Brewland Street, Bridge Street, the Cross and Church Lane. Before the Irvine was established in its present course, much of what is now built up would have been too wet. By 1640, a bridge was erected over the Burnawn to give access to the few houses east of the burn. This bridge replaced an earlier ford and was the first bridge in the parish. The town did not grow much until the 18th century. The extension was initially over the Burnawn to Polwarth Street and Dales, now Wallace Street. By the middle of the century, the town had doubled in size on lands viewed by the Duke of Portland, who had acquired the manse lands from the church, and the new streets bore the names associated with his family, such as Henrietta Street, which dates from about 1790 and was completed by 1860, by which time the Four Corners was much as it is now. By then, Titchfield Street, formerly Lake Street, and Bentinck Street, initially Bentinck Terrace, had quickly been built up. The population by then had risen to almost 3,000. Also built up by the 1860s were Chapel Lane, Bar Street, Kilnow, and Howes Square, also known at times as Furnace Row, Ironworks Square, and then Carnalee. Bowling Green Lane led to an actual bowling green, and further west along Titchfield Street, Gas Lane led to a gasworks. Orchard Street was built up as far as New Street, and Garden Street was well established. The growth of the town continued for the rest of the century with the increasing activity in coal mining, and houses were built for miners in such places as Boyd Street and John Street off Titchfield Street, which had extended to Standalane Street. Outside the town, more miners' cottages were erected at the Gauchland, Goatfoot, Maxwood, and next to the Irvine at Loudon Rose. Streets such as Maxwood Road and the Glebe Road area were well established. By the start of the First War, the population had risen to about 4,000, with streets such as Blair Street, Station Road and Duke Street being completed. Living conditions were among the worst in Ayrshire, with over a third of the population in single rooms, and this when families often ran into double figures. Between the wars, a great many houses were built by the local authorities, both town and county councils. These were built mainly to improve the housing stock, with the county houses in particular housing those whose miners' cottages had been sadly lacking in sanitary provision. The population had by then reached 5,000. After the Second War, a great deal of council house building continued, initially with prefabs to house homecoming servicemen. These have long been replaced. The lack of industry in the town meant that Galston had to rely heavily on domestic rates for income, and even by the 1950s there was still a great deal of substandard housing in the town, and much council building remained to be done. At this time, Galston had the reputation of being the worst housed borough in Ayrshire. While they may not be to everyone's taste, Galston must be given credit for the variety of housing provided. Although there has been very little council building in the last 30 years, expansion continues with a great deal of private building, as at Belvedere View, Cairn View, Cessnock Place, Sorn Place, Barcastle Gardens and Andrew Lundy Place. The changes in local government finance since the demise of the old boroughs has meant that Galston's share of the income now comes from a larger pool, and the lack of industry has probably helped to attract incomers who travel to work elsewhere. The badly needed bypass has also helped to improve the amenity of the town. Industry was slow to arrive in Galston, which for many years was the centre of a thriving agricultural area. But by the beginning of the 19th century, it had a flourishing textile industry. Originally weaving in fine linen goods, many of the weavers transferred to silks and muslins. There were also around 24 tambourers who specialised in the production of Ayrshire white needlework, which is still carried on by a few enthusiasts like Liz Pirrie. The lathe from the old Strath paper mill carried on to operate the meal mill at Bar Mill, of which only the shell remains. The adjacent miller's house is still occupied. The mill is mentioned in parish records as far back as 1569. The linen weavers worked in locally grown flax, which was converted into linen threads in mills such as at the Kilnow, which also housed a walk mill and a dye house. It later became a sawmill and was demolished between the wars. The first cotton loom arrived in Galston in 1787, and within a few years 40 weavers' cottages were built in Lake Street and Orchard Street. At its peak there were around 450 hand looms in the town. Embargoes during the American Civil War virtually killed off linen and cotton weaving in Galston, but another industry blossomed. As early as 1509, permission was granted to search for coal on the lands of Bruntwood, but we don't know how successful this undertaking was. The next mention of coal extraction in the district was in 1640, but still on a very small scale and largely in shallow seams on the Cessnock estate. In fact, there were still fewer than 10 miners in Galston parish in 1800. The first proper mines were probably at the Gauchland opposite the farm, and where the last coal extraction took place when open cast mining was carried out around 1990. In 1839, 3 furnaces were started at Howie's Square to smelt ironstone mined at Cessnock, but this was of poor quality and the ironworks closed within 5 years. The hunt for coal had begun in earnest, and by 1848 a branch railway line had opened in Galston to exploit the rich coal seams in the area. By the 1850s, deep mining had begun at the Streethead and Gauchland pits. Coal mining brought an air of prosperity to the town, as well as an influx of workers largely from Ireland, and by the last quarter of the century, Galston was truly a mining town. It overtook Newmilns as the largest town in the Irvine Valley, with over 1,000 miners employed in 15 pits in the vicinity of the town. By the turn of the century, Galston was producing more than half of the total output of the Ayrshire coalfield. The depression in the 1920s with the miners' lockouts brought hardship to the town. The 1926 general strike saw the mines being flooded as the pumps were turned off, and although some were opened, the last bit at Maxwood was finally abandoned in 1933. A firm of mining engineers, Andrew Kyle and Company, survived the closure of the pits by successfully developing into mineral borers, but they employed less than 20 men locally. Other industry was still offering employment then. Richmonds had been making woolen bonnets in Crooked Home, but moved to the site of the old flax mill in Bar Street, known locally as the Splash Mill, and in use since the 18th century. It was taken over by the cooperative in 1913, who built another mill behind Garden Street in the old drying fields. The mill closed in the 1980s, and the site now contains recently built housing known as Richmond Place. There were also several hosieries in the town, which are descendants of the once numerous stocking makers. The major one is Sharp's, later known as Mackie's, which is now called Balmoral, who have also taken over the old Browns Institute as a mill shop. No longer in existence is Prentice's, which started up in the 1920s behind Titchfield Street and closed in the early 80s. Other smaller firms were John Connell's off Church Lane, in a building which later housed Allen's engineering workshop, and Bowman's Hosiery in a shed behind the house at 2 Blair Street. Bowman also had a shed through a pend, which ran behind Wallace Street near the Picture House. 2 lace factories had been established in Barmill Road, J.M. Robertson, which opened in 1880, and Peden Young and Baird, later Henry and Company, but they did not survive the depression in the trade in the 1960s. In total, nearly 400 girls were employed in the various textile works in the town. Udall's ran a lace mill with only 3 lace machines from 1925 to 1939, when the machinery was sold to a lace firm in Darvel. The building was used as a food store during the war, and has had a wide variety of uses since then, and at present it is a factory outlet shop. There are now only relatively small employers in the town. George Cunningham runs a successful road transport system in what used to be known as the Duke of Portland's Yard, and where the slaughterhouse once stood. John and Sheena Thompson started selling and leasing vending machines in 1979. After short spells in rented accommodation in Darvel and Newmilns, they moved into the old Freekirk building in 1987. Probably the most successful operation of its kind in Scotland, Dextat now employs 14 people. It is difficult to determine when the first school was provided in Galston, but there was a parish school attached to the parish church in the late 17th century. By the early 19th century, classes for free church members were held in the Bar Castle. It was called Bar School until another of the same name was built in Station Road in 1859, which is now used for community activities. Henrietta Scott opened a free Sunday school for impoverished children at the Cross. It accommodated 30 children with a dwelling house above for the schoolmaster, although it appears that the teaching initially was by the moonlighting teacher from the Bar School, who benefited to the tune of £5 per annum. The building was later the parish office, and at present it hosts the Old People's Welfare Club on the ground floor, while upstairs is a private dwelling. A free school for deserving children called the Blair's School opened in Polwarth Street in 1841, under the terms of a bequest of Charles Blair of Longhouse. There were always equal numbers of each sex, and it had 120 pupils when taken over by the school board. The building survives, having been a post office and shops, and is now a dwelling house. When primary education was made compulsory in 1872, the Burnside School was built. It is still in use for the younger primary classes. Secondary education arrived with the higher grade school in Glebe Road in 1910. This imposing building is now the primary school, as secondary education is no longer provided in the town. The Roman Catholic Church in Bentinck Street, from its opening in 1886, provided an education for primary children in an adjacent building. The children received an equivalent education to the state schools, with the addition of an understanding of their faith. They are now housed in this building, which unfortunately looks like a typical modern school. There has been a nursery school here at the top of Brulin Street for over 50 years. Galston parish has always had several pockets of small numbers of people living out with the town proper. In fact, the name Galston was originally applied to what is now Cessnock Castle, but was originally Galston Tower. Records suggest a village or a row of cottages to the south of the tower, but there is now no sign of this. Around 1300, the tower and its lands were in the possession of the Keiths and passed through marriage to the Hamilton family and successively to Stuarts and Rosses, until acquired by the Campbells of Cessnock in the 17th century, when the name was changed. These Campbells were descended from a second son of a George Campbell of Loudon, and held Cessnock from around 1500. Cessnock was originally a building near Crossroads. No longer in existence, it was a farm for many years, and Alison Begbie worked there. She was immortalised by Robert Burns as the lass on Cessnock banks. The farm, however, retained the name Tour, and although it is now known as Cessnock Farm, the adjacent building, now a dwelling house, is still called Tour Byre. The main tower of Cessnock Castle is a 15th century construction. The castle passed by marriage from the Campbells to the Earl of Marchmont in 1740, and later to Miss Henrietta Scott, who became the Duchess of Portland. Under Portland ownership, the Cessnock lands were transformed, with many improvements in the agricultural system. Farm buildings were improved and tenants granted much larger leases. Rents were now paid in cash rather than in kind. The Duke provided drainage tiles from his new tile works and encouraged the use of lime from his new kilns, as well as the planting of trees for shelter belts. The present owner, Stephen Cogley, has made a very good start to restoring castle and grounds to their former glory. Bruce Campbell of Sornbeg had been involved in the development of the brown and white Ayrshire dairy cow, whilst factor to the Earl of Marchmont, and by 1837 Galston parish was producing 200 tonnes of cheese annually, and farm labourers enjoyed a good standard of living. Herds of Ayrshire cows are still maintained. Their milk is kept separate and sold at a premium. Another large estate in Galston parish is Lunfeen, which formed a beautiful large wooded area occupying much of the land south of Newmilns and Darvel. Its earliest known mention is when the chaplain at Cessnock was granted the income of Linfine Estate in 1471. The lands appear to have passed to the Lockharts of Bar in 1573 to about 1670, when it passed to the Campbells of Cessnock. The male line died out early in the 18th century, and the lands of Cessnock, including Linfine, were sold off. The Linfine lands were purchased in 1769 by a banker, John Brown, whose father was a surgeon in Newmills, and who had already bought Waterhawes, the property of his maternal grandfather. John Brown had learned the weaving trade from Alexander Blair of Longhouse, and then made a fortune in trading in linen with the Americas, and through banking in Glasgow, where he also owned linen mills. A new mansion house was built by Mauchline mason James Armour, the father-in-law of Robert Burns, and Linfine House was completed in 1772. The estate remained in the Brown family, and Thomas Brown, who had been a professor of botany, was responsible for planting many exotic trees and shrubs, and large areas of woodland which are now mature. Less hardy species were grown in greenhouses within the walled garden. By the death of his son, also Thomas, in 1873, the lands had extended from 400 to over 10,000 acres. By then it was a magnificent country estate with tree-lined avenues and 3 gatehouses, 2 in Newmills and 1 in Darvel. Brown's Road was built as a riverside walk between the towns, and bridges at Craigview Road in Newmills and Ranelcote Road in Darvel provided access. Thomas's sister Martha was the last of the Browns to hold the estate, and she died in 1897. She is remembered for her charitable work in the valley, both privately by helping needy individuals, and at public level by, for example, establishing the Browns Institutes and providing public drinking fountains in the 3 towns. The death of Martha Brown saw Linfine pass out of local ownership, and it had several owners in the 20th century. By 1967, the estate was being broken up, and in 1982, most of the tenant farmers were able to purchase their farms, and Linfine House and the remaining policies, amounting to just 2,800 acres, were bought by a German millionaire, Herr Rosner. The estate still contains 6 farms and 13 country cottages. In the east of Galston parish, and having no real connection with the town, is the small village of Priestland. Because of its name and the nearby name of Ladybrough, it is probable that the original inhabitants performed some religious purpose. In the past, Priestland provided a fair amount of work for a variety of trades and other service providers, such as a meal mill. But when Darvel started to expand, It proved a magnet for the craftsmen and others, and today there is not even a single shop. In the 19th century, there were rows of cottages for agricultural workers on both sides of the Sorn Road, here at Sorn Hill. These were thatched and had clay or flagstone floors. There was even an inn which was well used by thirsty travellers. The houses had no water or sewerage, and although most have now gone, some on the east side of the road have been modernised and are now popular as desirable country residences. Where there were 20 or so families here 100 years ago, there are now about half a dozen. Another small group of houses on the Cessnock estate was at Quarry House, where a few buildings have survived. And if water and electricity had been piped in between the two wars, when many were being condemned, many more could have survived to enhance the countryside. Burn House was for a long time in the property of Cessnock Estate and formed a small village outside the town. The houses were occupied by estate workers, and the village included a sawmill, storehouse and barn. Some of the old houses remain and form part of a pleasant residential area. Fourteen plots of land were given to ex-servicemen after the First War, when the large farm of Meikle Maxwood was broken up. The sites now contain new bungalows, with a few of the original corrugated tin structures now being used as outhouses. There were many fine unfortified mansions or laird's houses, such as at Sorn Hill and Bruntwood, which dates from around 1700 and shows the coat of arms of the Moore family above a lintel. The leisure pursuit which was most associated with Galston in the past was that of handball or hornball, which was an ancient game but eventually was mainly played by miners. The major games were played at the Borelli, where the Titchfield or World Cup was contested each Glasgow Fair Saturday by teams of 3. The last championship game was played in 1939. Although unsuccessful attempts were made to revive the game after the war, it is now just a memory, like Peevers, Pearies and Punty. Also popular in the past was curling. This was played originally on frozen rivers and ponds, but eventually Galston had its purpose-built rinks on Haymouth Loch, on the Sorn Road, just across the road junction from Little Cessnock, which was then called Haymouth. The game died out locally early in the 20th century. Galston had a senior football team from 1890, which originally played at the Riverside Park, and then crossed the road to the Portland Park. They had their successes, winning the Ayrshire Cup on 6 occasions between 1903 and 1925. As recently as 1936, Galston won the Scottish Qualifying Cup, but within 3 years were no longer in existence. Nowadays, the local amateur team, Galston United, play at the Bar Mill. They reached the final of the Scottish Amateur Cup in 1994. Other teams play at the pitches at the West End. Pitch and toss was another popular pastime with the Galston miners, but not exclusively. This was a very simple gambling game, when bets were placed on the toss of 2 coins, and considerable sums of money were wagered. There were several tossing schools in quiet corners close to the town, including here at Bar Mill. The craze died out early in the 1950s. The betting men in the town had a more exciting venue also at Bar Mill. This was the dog racing track, which was well patronised until the Second War, and although it continued to operate until the 1960s, falling attendances forced its closure. For a time, golf was played on this park off the road between Burnhouse and Cessnock, but it stopped when the Golf Club opened up at Loudon. For many years, angling was a popular pastime, and although not so common now, it is no longer confined to the rivers and burns, since the provision of ponds stocked with trout, as here, just off the Galston bypass. Bowling used to be played at the foot of the aptly named Bowling Green Lane, as did kiting. Kiting moved to goat foot, but the game has not been played in Galston for a very long time. The bowlers moved to this green off Station Road and behind the Bar School, where as Galston Bowling Club they have been playing for over 100 years. The other bowling green in the town was established on a patch of land in Loudon parish at the west end of Titchfield Street and once part of Standalane Farm. The green was built to accommodate mining families. It continues to operate as the Loudon Working Men's Bowling Club. It suffered badly from the last flood of the River Irvine during the construction of the bypass, and for a time the grass had to be replaced with artificial turf. The Gauchland Coal Company formed a reed band in 1872, which changed after a few years to a brass band as Galston Borough Band. It has had its successes over the years as well as bad times, and it now survives as part of New Mills and Galston Brass. Here we see them welcoming home the Old People's Welfare Club from their annual trip. The Browns Institute was built in 1874 by Miss Martha Brown of Lunfean to provide facilities for education and recreation for working men. Good use was made of the building, latterly mainly as a billiards hall until the 1950s. The building is now used as a mill shop for the hosiery in Church Lane. The most popular form of entertainment for much of the 20th century was the pictures. Through an entry in Wallace Street was the Victoria or Empire Hall, now gone, which showed films for a while. It was also used as a roller skating rink at one time and as a store by the military during the war. Also a venue for vaudeville shows, it was popularly known as Tom Clark's Geggy. The purpose-built picture house opened in 1912 on the opposite side of Wallace Street. It was run by the Gilroy family until its closure in 1968. The building is now used by the local vet. As children, many of us looked for Bernon pebbles, but few have taken it as seriously as Jackie Gorey, who transforms rocks obtained from the burn into beautiful jewellery. Here in Titchfield Street, this modern gym caters for people of all ages and degrees of fitness. With the introduction of the textile industry and then coal mining, the village evolved into a relatively prosperous little town, but the inhabitants had no real say over the running of their affairs until the creation of a police borough in 1864. The new council quickly got to work. They soon had a supply of gas to the street lamps and a lamplighter employed. A gas company was already supplying gas from its works at the foot of Gas Lane. Early council meetings were held in the Blair School or the Black Bull Inn, and from 1926 in this mock baronial building at the Cross. It only contained a council room and offices, with no large hall for public events. Although there have been many small halls in the town, there has never been one large enough for the people to come together as a community. As Galston was classed a distressed area, a community centre was provided in 1937 and came under the control of the Ayrshire Education Committee. The building here is still well utilised for a wide range of activities. The council levied rates for the upkeep of roads, streets and civers, and levied a tax on all cattle and pigs sold in the town. By 1867, Galston obtained a police presence. For most of the time, the police station was in Church Lane, in what is now a dental surgery. At present, the police office is the only one in the valley actually manned by police officers. The arrival of the railway in the 1840s saw an expansion of services in the town, and although built to transport iron, it was soon carrying large quantities of freight, mainly coal, and many passengers. This telephone exchange occupies part of the old station. With the erection of its new central premises in 1901, the cooperative society played a major role in the town, serving most of the needs of the people. It even issued tokens to be used for paying for deliveries in lieu of cash. As in other towns locally, the co-op has deserted the borough, but at least the main building has been tastefully converted into flats. There were several banks in the town, but only the Bank of Scotland, formerly the British Linen Bank, remains. This building opened just after the war in Milton Road and still provides a meeting place for the older men in the community. The library moved from the Browns Institute to here in Henrietta Street in the 1970s. From the surgery and clinic in Henrietta Street, the town is well served medically. Possibly because of its large rural population, and possibly because of the poor health associated with the working and living conditions of the miners, Galston already had 4 doctors when their similarly sized neighbours had 1 apiece. Like many mining areas, there were many pubs in the town, 17 around 1900, as well as several carry-out establishments. Galston is the only valley town never voting to be dry, and is still very well served today. There is no longer a brewery, but this is probably the origin of Brewland Street, and as recently as 1830 there was a brewer resident in the town. Many other shops served the town well, and although somewhat of a dormitory town, there is now an air of prosperity. The number of shops and small businesses still operating suggest that Galston is resisting the pull of the supermarkets and retail estates better than its neighbours.